Welcome to the PHP Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to be talking about the for each loop in PHP. As a reminder, make sure you've got your text editor up and running. You'll notice I've got a new icon on the screen, and that's for brackets. Adobe has announced a new text editor called Brackets, working for both the Macintosh and the PC. Actually, I've tried it. It works quite well. I mean, I like my Sublime Text too. It's one I've been using for years and years, but for a free editor, Brackets is a very, very nice editor. So just thought I'd pass that out. In this tutorial, we're going to be discussing the for each loop in PHP. The for each loop construct provides an easy way to iterate over arrays. And you'll see that when we go into the lab and do our demonstrations. We'll actually do quite a few demonstrations with working with arrays with this for each loop. For each works only on arrays and objects. For each loops will generate an error when you attempt to use it on a different type or different data type other than arrays and objects. So again, the for each loop only works with arrays and objects in PHP. There are two different types of syntaxes that we can use when we initiate this loop, and we're going to demonstrate both of these in our lab. The first example loops over the array given by the array name and just assigns a value, and then we execute the statements inside our curly braces. And again, we'll demonstrate this in the lab. We also have a second example, which will additionally assign the current element's key to the key variable on each iteration of the array. So again, we're using that array name, and then we're setting up key value pairs. And we'll demonstrate both ways of using this for each loop when we get into the lab. So let's demonstrate the loops in our development environment. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's drop into our development environment. First thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and make certain that we've got our Apache server up and running, because obviously we'll be working with PHP, so we will need that server up and running. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Sublime Text 2, which will be the text editor that I'll be using for this demonstration, and I'm going to load up Google Chrome, which will be the browser I'm using. I've got a standard template, an HTML5 template that I'm using for this demonstration. Just a very bare bones HTML5 document. I have created a CSS file just to give us a little bit of a screen to view as we're working through the demonstrations. Again, bare bones CSS file. I've got some body formatting. I have a container. I have a demo area that's that darker gray area that you see right here. And just an H2 heading which talks about demonstrating of the for each loop. So again, just a bare bones document, bare bones HTML document. Couple of divs set up to include my container and my demo area. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to go in and do our first demonstration on the for each loop. Again, keep in mind that the for each loop only works with arrays and with objects. So the first thing I want to do, and I'm going to actually enter all this stuff. I'm actually going to copy it from my text file, but I'm just going to talk about it as we put it in because I want you to understand what we're doing. Let me go ahead and scroll up a little bit so you get a good view of this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an array. And I've assigned my array the name ARR. Again, if you're familiar with PHP, you know the $ signifies the variable name. So I've assigned my array the name ARR, and I've given it 6 numeric values, 1 through 6. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my for each loop, and we'll talk about this as we enter it in. I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in so you don't have to watch me type. So I've set up a for each loop, and I've said that the AR array as value. So I'm assigning that array as a value in my loop. Then I'm taking that value and I'm saying a value is equal to value times 5. So I'm taking whatever value is in the array, I'm multiplying it by 5, I'm echoing it to my screen so that you can actually see what the value is. Then I'm going to put in a line break. So it's going to generate to a new line, and then it's going to walk through this array till all the values are done. I like the for each loop working with arrays because it's rather easy to understand. I mean, I don't have a whole lot of stuff going on here. I don't have a whole bunch of counters or anything. It's actually walking through each value of the array, assigning it a new value, putting it to the screen, and then when it's done, it walks out of the for each loop. So let's go ahead and save those changes. In fact, what I'm going to do, let's go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this as for each one. So if you have access to the exercise files, we won't overwrite our template, plus you'll actually have the availability to walk through these and have each one as examples, because we're going to do quite a few different examples of this. I want you to get a good grasp as to how these for each loops work. So I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Let's go into our browser. I'm going to go back, refresh that. Let's load that for each one.php, and you'll see now that we've got the 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. And again, it's because I've taken these values and I've multiplied them by 5. So not only am I reading the values from the array, but I'm actually doing something with that value, then I'm displaying it on my screen. It is recommended that when we're referencing an array that we unset that when we're finished. So what we should do, because that value, reference of the variable value in the last array element remain even after the for each loop is completed. So it's always recommended that we destroy it by doing an unset. And you can actually do that just by typing unset. That's a built-in function inside of PHP. And then inside my parentheses, I'm just going to put value, because what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to unset that value that we've been playing with inside of our for each loop. And that just destroys the last value that's still part of that loop once we complete going through. So save the change again. You'll notice nothing different on our screen other than the fact that if I were to echo the value of value right now, we will have no value because we've actually unset it. There'll be nothing there. Again, save as undefined variable. Because we unset the value, there is nothing it doesn't exist anymore. Very good. So, if you don't have any questions, let's go ahead and move on to our next demonstration of for each loops in PHP. All right, so in the second demonstration, first off, let's go ahead and pull this out. Let's go ahead and pull out all the code that we have between our PHP tags. Let's go ahead and do a save as. I want to save this as for each 2. So again, we're going to have nothing inside there right now. If I go back and reload for each 2, we should just have a nice blank screen. I'm going to make this one a little more complicated. Let's go ahead and put our array in. Again, I'm just going to copy this from a text file so you don't have to watch me type it, but I will talk about it once I get it in the screen. So I've created a list array, and I've created an array. I've named it list, and I've put in apples, oranges, peaches, carrots, and peas. So we've actually given this 5 different values inside this array. And what I want to demonstrate now is the difference between using a while loop, which we've already looked at, and using the for each loop, and why I tend to like the for each loop better when I'm working with arrays. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy from my text file. Let me come down a couple lines so it's easy for you to see. And I've got this while loop. And now I'm saying while list, and list is a built-in function inside PHP. While list has a value, and that equals each, in other words, another built-in function in PHP. And here's where I'm actually referencing that array that we've made. There is no correlation between the list function, the built-in function, and the list name that I've given it. In fact, if I were to change that name, it would work the exact same way. And I may do that so it's not so confusing. But what I'm saying here is while list has a value, print out each list, and I'm giving it a value with text, and then I'm assigning the value from the array itself. A little complicated to understand. So I'm going to take another line of PHP code, and right below that while loop, let's go ahead and move this down. I'm just going to echo that the while loop is above and the for each loop is below. And to me, the for each loop code is so much easier to understand when we're looking at arrays, because now I'm just saying for each. For each list is value. So in other words, for every value that's in the array list, I want you to echo to my screen value and the value that's in that value variable. So to me, this is so much easier to understand than looking at this while loop and trying to figure out, okay, I'm using a built-in function list, I'm using a built-in function each, and these have to be equal. To me, it's just harder to understand that statement than it is this statement here. For each list, in other words, for every value that's in the list array, print it. Simple. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Let's go ahead and refresh the browser window. You will see absolutely no difference in the way these appear. I have that while loop above. You'll notice I've got the value apples, value oranges. Everything looks identical. They work exactly the same way. Again, the biggest key to me is that it just seems much easier to understand the for each loop when I'm working with the array than the while loop when I'm working with the array. And you'll see that in the next example again, because I'm going to do another example. This time we're actually going to bring out the key value pairs. In other words, I'm going to bring out a key and a value with the array, which makes it a little bit easier to read on your screen. So let's go ahead and save all those changes as, I want to make sure we save that as for each 2, because our next one is going to be for each 3. And we'll do that one right now. All right, so let's look at one more example of how this for each loop works, because I really want you to have a good grasp of these, because I do tend to use these a lot in my code. And keep in mind that inside that loop, we can do anything inside those curly braces. We can reference functions, we can take the values we're pulling out of the array and assign them somewhere else. I mean, anything that we can do inside of our script, we can do inside those curly braces. All right, so the first thing, let's go ahead and create the array. And I'm going to create an array this time called myArray. So I'm going to come inside my PHP tags and create my array, and it's going to be equal to an array, and I'm going to assign different values to it. Let's do a save as before we accidentally overwrite our 2 file. Let's save this as for each 3.php. So again, if you have access to the exercise files, you'll have a copy of each one of these, and you can work through it yourself if you want to compare what we were doing with these for each loops. All right, so I've created this array called myArray, and I've given it values of 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I put in a numeric value, then I put in some string data, and then I put in another numeric value. So the first thing I'm trying to emphasize here, understand that arrays can store any types of values. They don't have to all be numeric, they don't have to all be strings. Arrays can store a good variety. In fact, it can store any values that we can store for data inside of PHP. And that's almost true. That's true with almost all arrays in our programming languages. So we can store all data. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and put a line under here because I want you to see something before we actually work with our for each loop. So right below my array, I'm going to tell it print r my array. And this is a built-in function inside PHP that allows us to print arrays. It gives us the key value pairs of those arrays. So I'm going to put in a couple of break tags. And I'm doing this because I want you to see, once we put in the for each loop, exactly what we pulled out. So let's go ahead and save all those changes in for each 3.php. Let's go back here and make sure that we've loaded up for each 3. And you'll see now I get a nice printout of the array itself, the array that I've created. And I know that my key 0 is holding 1, key 1 is holding 2, key 2 is holding 3. And keep in mind that arrays are 0-based, as I'm sure you probably remember from other programming languages. So everything is a 0-based in the array. So our first key is always going to be 0 unless we assign a key as the first key other than 0. So since it's a 0-based array, all arrays are 0-based, you'll notice it starts with 0 and it goes up, and the last key I have in here is key 6, which is storing the value of 1. All right, now let's look at our for each loop and how we can use the for each loop to bring out key value pairs. So for each my array, again, we're referencing the array that we created as key equal value. In other words, what I want to pull out now is I want to pull out the key and the value, and I'm going to echo those to my screen. The key is going to be the key, and then the value is going to be the value. So if I save those changes, refresh my browser window, you'll see now that I have a key of 0 with the value of 1. And the same thing is here. That's why I did the print r. So you can see that we have that same summation up here where we did the print r. My key is 0, my value is 1. My key is 1, my value is 2. Key is 2, my value is 3. So it's showing us the key and the value. And what we created in the bottom one is the same thing using that for each loop. We've actually had the key values echoed to our screen using the for each loop and then assigning the myArray as key value pairs. So I hope that kind of clears up or helps you understand how we use for each loops in our programming. I tend to use them all the time. I think I'm going to do one more demonstration because you can actually assign keys to the array as we're building the array. And once we get into the array, because I'm actually going to do a couple tutorials on arrays because arrays are very important in PHP, you'll see how we can have associative arrays and 0-based index arrays and all kinds of cool things that we can do with arrays inside of PHP. All right, so let me do one more demonstration because I want to get into a little more detail about these key value pairs and understanding exactly how this for each loop is working. Okay, so I've created a foreach4.php. I've taken out all the code from the previous exercise. I've saved that file inside of my localhost, and right now I've just got a blank screen. First thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and create the array, but I'm going to create the array a little bit differently this time. So inside of my PHP tags, I'm actually going to create this array, and I've named the array myArray1. It equals an array, but what I've done is I've created an array with key value pairs. So instead of letting it be 0 equal 1, and 1 equal 2, and 2 equal 3, and 4 equals 17, I've actually assigned the keys to this particular array. So I've said 1 equals 1, 2 equals 2, 3 equals 3, 17 equals 17. So I've actually given the keys my own name. This is called an associative array. And when we go through the demonstrations and tutorials on arrays, I'll actually cover these in a lot more detail. But I wanted you to see that you can actually assign the keys to the arrays if you wanted to. And actually, when we're using for each loops, it works a little bit to our advantage to know what the keys are. Because suppose this was a user's information. I might have the first key as first name, second name, or last name, street address, city, state, so forth and so forth. So I'd know what those values relate to inside my array. Now when I print the array, and again I'm going to do the same thing we had done in the previous example, I'm going to come right below that array itself, and I'm going to use another print R, and I'm going to say, look, I want you to print the values of my array 1, and then I'm just going to put in a couple of line breaks. So let's go ahead and save those changes. If we refresh the browser window and we have foreach4.php loaded, you'll see now I've got that array on my screen, and it tells me array key 1 equals 1. Remember, I've assigned the key 1 to 1. Key 2 equals 2, 3 equals 3, 17 equals 17, because I've actually assigned those keys to that slot in the array. This is still index 0. We just don't see it as index 0 anymore because we've actually assigned a value to the index. Had we not assigned it, this would be 0, this would be 1, this would be 2, this would be 3, and so on and so forth. Now for the for each loop, again, I'm going to copy it. I'm going to come right below that echo where I've echoed my line breaks. So for this for each loop, I'm basically going to do the same thing I did before, but I want you to realize that you can use the name, any name you want for the names of these variables. So you'll notice I'm saying for each myArray1, which is the name of my array, and I'm saying as variable k to variable v. So instead of using key value like I did last time, I'm just letting you know I'm using whatever I want to use. I could make this C and D, A and B, whatever. It's going to store the key, and the second one's going to store the value. And then I'm just echoing out myArray1 key, and I'm putting the key in square braces, and then equals what value. And then I'm giving it a line break so it goes to the next line. So if I save those changes, refresh my browser window, you're going to see now I get myArray1, key 1 equals 1, key 2 equals 2, key 3 equals 3, key 17 equals 17. And the only reason it appears with the square brackets is because that's the way I actually displayed it or echoed it to the screen. The only reason I'm seeing the $sign and it's not treating it as an array is because I've got that / in front of it. It's an escape character. So I can escape it and actually use that as a display character inside HTML. So a lot of cool things we can do with the for each loop. The for each loop is very, very powerful. The key to remember with for each is we can only use it when we're referencing as arrays, and we can only use it for objects. So if I were to try to reference this to any other type of variable inside of PHP, it's going to generate an error. It only works for objects and it only works for arrays inside of PHP. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.